So, Tricia, we just got back from a tour of Knoxville, a tour of religious communities in Knoxville. We saw everything from a Vietnamese Catholic parish to a Christian Scientist church to Jewish synagogues. We saw a large diversity
Yeah.
in just a few square miles.
Yeah.
But what was really sticking out to me and really is the center of your research is how many of these communities are ethnically, racially divided. So, why are congregations so divided,
Yeah.
and especially along racial lines?
Yeah. Congregations run the gamut in the U.S. religious landscape. And we know that the context of the United States with regard to religious freedom means that congregations of all types can thrive, right? So one of the reasons that scholars point to is the fact that this context of freedom that allows so many congregations to flourish means that there are lots to choose from, right? Some even call this a religious marketplace. So if you have a marketplace of options, then it might be that you look for a place that has others like me. So this is one of the factors, right? You look at the landscape and say, what church do I want to go to? What congregation looks right for me? And you might look for one. Hey, there are others who look like me there. So this is one of the reasons. Another reasons that scholars point to is that congregations, churches, temples, these are places where people can build bonds to others like themselves and build their identity, particularly among more marginalized groups in society. So it might be that that Sunday morning or that Saturday opportunity to get together is a place where you can really magnify your voice and feel like your concerns are shared. This is especially true for immigrants, for example. So if you're coming to a new country, perhaps you don't share the language, you feel othered in the broader community. So the congregation can be a useful place to amplify shared voices. So it becomes a we or an us in a broader them. So that's another reason. The other thing too that scholars look at is, we tend to use our networks in order to build our communities. And what that means is that if we want to tell someone about whether it's our school or our workplace or our congregation, then we're going to tell our friends. And our friends oftentimes mirror similar networks, racially, economically, educationally. So if I say, hey, to my friend, you should come to my church, then me bringing my friend is going to, again, magnify that same division in terms of perhaps mirroring my own networks, which might be similar racially, educationally, class-wise, or otherwise. And then another thing I would mention too is just that, of course, in the context of Knoxville, as we saw on our drive around town, we see this around the country. Neighborhoods are still pretty segregated along racial and economic lines. So some of this is changing, but you see embedded in cities the kinds of social boundaries that emerge from choosing one's neighborhood, or sometimes it comes across as choosing a school, or choosing an area that feels comfortable. Well, oftentimes that place that feels comfortable, that is accessible or affordable, is going to mirror those same kind of divisions. And if congregations are nestled into neighborhoods, then those congregations are going to reflect that kind of segregation that's already happening in neighborhoods. And in fact, some of the scholarship shows that congregations are even more divided than their neighborhood, meaning that sometimes they express an even higher level of segregation than the neighborhood that's surrounding. But the residents, the ecology of the neighborhood is going to matter a lot for what the congregation looks like.
So what I'm interested in is these terms divided and segregated. They have kind of a negative valence to them, especially with the history of the United States, with segregation and the civil rights movement, stuff like that. But what I hear you saying is these people are self-selecting in some respect. They're choosing to drive 40 minutes to go to their Vietnamese parish because they want to be with, they want to be in a congregation that speaks their language or their native language. So can you speak to this idea of the religious marketplace where people are choosing to self-select into these congregations?
Yeah, people are choosing. And in fact, the whole idea of a congregation is again, especially within the context of religious freedom, it relies on voluntary association, right? So it means that people are choosing a place that feels like home to them. So this is not prescripted, this is not forced, but it does, the ways in which people choose reflect these sort of internal boundaries that people draw between us and them. And there's some, I think, differences too along denominational lines, and the extent to which one is allowed to choose or expected to choose or not. I mean, even I study a lot about Catholics, and technically in the Catholic Church, it's based on this territorial parish system that actually does draw geographic boundaries that
Mm.
says, okay, all the Catholics in this neighborhood belong to this parish. But we know, again, based on that, especially that penchant for choice, is that a lot of Catholics, like a lot of other religious adherents, will say, "Oh, I'm going to drive by the congregation that is closest to me because I want to go somewhere else." Right. So
Mm.
it is choice within this broader structure of how religious organizations work, how polity works, and how we think about lines between ourselves and others.
Hmm. So, speaking of Catholics, this is the center of your research. I have a copy of your book right here, Parish and Place, where you speak about this. So, the parish is a territorial uh, term, it's
Yes.
referring to a literal place.
Yes.
But some of this self sorting, voluntary association, is now. It's not just territorial. You
Yeah.
will drive
Right.
from your town to a different town to be in the self-sorted Vietnamese parish or
Right.
Latino parish.
Right.
So how does this work against the idea of the territorial parish?
Yeah, it creates this challenge, right? Because the system, by canon law or the rules of the Catholic Church, say technically there are these territorial parishes. They're prescriptive by neighborhoods, much like polling zones or school zones. And yet, Catholics, and particularly American Catholics, tend to go where they want, right?
Mm.
So then, how do those two things mesh? And this book that I wrote tried to understand, especially the role of an alternative model of parishes, and that's the idea of the personal parish. In earlier iterations, it was called the national parish. But essentially, personal parishes, unlike territorial parishes, personal parishes meet a particular purpose or serve a special population of Catholics within a diocese. So that may be a group of Korean Catholics. It may be Catholics who prefer the Anglican use version of the liturgy. It may be those who are particularly interested in social justice. So these are personal parishes that are actually, by canon law and by the approval of the bishop, created to serve special populations of Catholics. So in the book, I talk about how the territorial parish is designed to be more of a generalist organization. It's the parish that meets all needs, right? The needs of everyone in its midst. But we know how challenging that can be, of course, as neighborhoods are increasingly diverse, as the U.S. Demography is increasingly diverse, and so personal parishes instead meet special needs and special purposes. And so some bishops and dioceses have gone forward by creating both of these types of parishes, right? Territorial parishes to serve the needs of everyone, and then personal parishes that is designed to serve the needs of just some. And in many ways, that becomes a bit of a compromise, I suppose, in a way that says here's a system that is accommodating to this deep desire for choice and history of choice that exists in the U.S. religious landscape in particular.
Hmm. And so, speaking of the U.S. religious landscape, this is more than just Knoxville. Like, do you have a
Yeah.
sense at what this looks like across the nation?
Yeah. So in the last, since the early 80s, about 200 new personal parishes have been created.
Hmm.
If you add those together with parishes that were national parishes in the older iterations of them and are still around today, we're talking about around 1,200 personal parishes. So it's roughly, it's a little less than 10% of the parish landscape around the country. So it's not that this type of parish is as common as the other, but it does say a lot about how does a religious body respond to both the desire for choice, also the particular needs, whether along racial or language or other lines that particular groups of religious adherents may need, and also just the challenge of a congregation serving the needs of all. So
Hmm.
recognizing that this dual model of building local religious organizations is strategic, right, in
Hmm.
order to accommodate these. Problematic maybe too, but strategic, right? It plays both sides of that coin.
Yeah. All right, so we've been talking a lot about Catholics and Christianity in general, and the term congregation itself seems to have a Christian valence, at least in my vocabulary.
Yeah.
But how does this look in other religious traditions?
Yeah.
I can imagine like a Sikh house of worship, for example, being very Punjabi.
Yeah.
Um, and Muslim, you might have an Indonesian congregation or an Arab congregation. So what does this look like outside of Christianity?
Yeah. Well, the thread that laces all of these traditions together is this real challenge of how do you bridge unity and diversity, right? How do you take all of those different things that we and religious adherents are going to bring into the spaces where we worship, and bridge those together, whether it's differences along the lines of generation or age or politics or race or what country is native to us. All of these things come together in these localized organizations that are what we might call congregations, right? But that take different names and different terms across traditions. But I think the reason why it's important for us to pay attention to how this works is that the ways in which these organizations or these communities come together say a lot about how people draw lines between us and them, right? Who is included, who is excluded? What does this mean for how we think about our ability to get along with others who are dissimilar from ourselves? And I think we can look at congregations or houses of worship as a way of really a microcosm of society writ large, right? It's saying, what does local community look like, and what are the limits or the challenges or the boundaries in bridging these kinds of uh, difficult conversations, right? That stem from difference, whether politically or racially or generationally or otherwise.
Hmm. It's just interesting how you have, like, on one hand, it's good that these communities want to gather together, like,
Right.
and find them. It's religious freedom in the
It's
United States, that is
Yeah.
their prerogative. And at the same time, you have like an interfaith movement of trying to
Yeah.
like talk across
Across these. Yeah.
across these divides. So it's
Yeah.
balancing like the diversity and the so-called tolerance or uh,
Right.
flourishing together in a pluralistic society. That term
Well,
pluralism.
yeah, and I think there's something to that too. I mean, one of the strength that congregations, and especially congregations that look more homophilous, right,
Mm.
that they'll look more similar, is that they're really strong in creating in-group bonds. So we can call this bonding capital, right, to
Hmm.
come out of Bob Putnam's work. So it helps you feel close and united to others. What these types of congregations are less effective in doing is creating bridging capital. Right? So how is it that if a congregation not only is separated along religious lines, but also amplified by separations along the lines of race or otherwise, then what that means is that communities are gathering in relatively siloed spaces. And so there's a limit to the bridging that's going to happen.
Hmm.
And it also can color your worldview or your perspective or how you interact with others dissimilar to oneself if you don't have that friend, right? The person who's sitting next to you in a pew, who is able to introduce through their own vantage point and life experience a wholly different perspective. So the bridging capital, or the ability of local religious organizations to bring people together, has to happen in other ways, right? Through other civic organizations, through
Hmm.
interfaith organizations, through other types of spaces that are able to bring these groups together, because that is what will offset the more potentially negative sides of this kind of local religious organizing. So it has the benefits, but it has the real drawbacks of bringing different people together.
Yeah, I mean, it really speaks to our political moment now, with immigration being such a front and center a political issue, at least in the United States,
Yeah.
there's this line of argument saying, "Oh, I don't mind about immigrants coming in, but they should integrate or they should
Yeah.
assimilate. They should learn English." So I like this phrase of bonding capital
Yeah.
and what bonding capital across
Yeah.
these different diverse and racially
Yeah.
divided communities might look like.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the reality is that these experiences have real ramifications for how we vote, for how we think of ourselves as civically engaged citizens, for the ways that we think about who belongs and who doesn't. And so religion has always been a powerful force in that. And the question is how, right? And what does that look like? And what are the potential strengths or limitations of religion in, if you want to say, overcoming certain boundaries or exacerbating certain boundaries versus amplifying them.
Hmm. So this research speaks to our current political moment
Right.
here in the United States, but it also speaks to the next 5, 10, 15 years, like as the demographics of the United States change.
Yeah.
So what does the future look like with this research?
Yeah, local religious organizations are a great place to look as a signal of what's to come and what's changing and what's not changing in terms of attitudes or demographic composition or otherwise. With regard to the racial composition of congregations, an increasing number of congregations are multiracial, and an increasing number of people who attend congregations are attending places that are multiracial, which means sometimes that means a super large congregation, which is going to be more likely potentially to have diversity on a variety of fronts. And sociologists have been measuring this for some time. And in fact, in measures even as recent as 10 years ago versus now, there are a higher and higher number of congregations that are reflecting internal diversity, so multiracial congregations. So this is changing over time. And I think we'll continue to move that direction. Congregations also embed other types of diversity, a higher level of diversity along lines of class, age, immigrant generation. So these things too, I think, move as we see changes writ large in the demographic profile of the United States. So I would anticipate that, and religious leaders are asking this question too, right? How do we, if they want multiracial congregations, if they want a congregation that reflects the kinds of diversity that they see in and around their neighborhood, then they're going to be trying to make pretty intentional decisions about how do we cultivate a place that is welcoming to all and that can create not only bonding capital among those who are similar to one another, but bridging capital to those who are very different.
Well, Dr. Tricia Bruce, thank you so much for joining me.
Great. Thanks for being here.